Good day, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the company that I chose to look into to see if it's a company that you should invest in or not. The company that I have chosen is Basic Fit from Belgium, and to know if it's a company that you should invest in or not, I have looked at a few ratios of the company and see how they do with those ratios. I have used 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022 from the company for those ratios. And with those years, we can see how they did in each year for that ratio. The ratios that I've chosen to look into are the return on equity, the return on assets, the current ratio, the asset ratio, the debt ratio, the customer credit, and the supplier credits. First of all, we're going to start with the return on equity. The return on equity is the measure of a company's net income divided by its shareholders' equity. The return on equity is a gauge of a corporation's profitability and how efficiently it generates those profits. The higher the return on equity, the better a company is at converting its equity financing into profits. As we can already see, for the 3 years, they are always under the zero, which is not good for the return on equity, because a good return on equity should at least be at 1, but they are below 0, so that is not good. And in 2021, they are very, very much below 0. The reason for this is because they had a very great loss in 2021, which caused their return on equity to be very low in that year. So the return on equity is not good for this company. Then we have the return on assets. The return on assets indicates a company's profitability in relation to its total assets. The return on assets can be used to determine whether a company uses its assets efficiently to generate a profit. For the return on assets, we can see in 2020 that it was above 0, but still below 1. For 2021, it was below 0 again, which is not good. And for 2022, it was slightly above 1, which is good. So the first 2 years were actually not so good for their return on assets, but in the last year, 2022, they had a better return on assets than the previous years. So that's good for them. Then we have the current ratio. The current ratio is a liquidity ratio, and that ratio measures a company's ability to pay short-term obligations. It tells the investors and analysts how a company can maximize the current assets on its balance sheet to satisfy its current debt and other payables. And if this ratio is 1 or above, that means it's a good ratio. So we can see for the 3 years, it never goes above 1 or is 1. So actually, this ratio is not so good for the company. Then we have the asset test ratio, or the asset ratio. This ratio compares a company's quick assets to its current liabilities. And same as for the current ratio. If this ratio is 1 or above, this means it's a good ratio. And for 2020, this ratio was slightly below 1, so it still wasn't good, but it was not the worst. But in the later 2 years, it fell down to 0.27 and 0.32, so it was worse in the next 2 years, which is not good for the company. Then we have the debt ratio. And the debt ratio refers to a financial ratio that measures the extent of a company's leverage. The debt ratio is defined as a ratio of total debt to total assets, expressed as a percentage. And for if the debt ratio is below 100%, that means they normally have a good debt ratio. They can pay for all their debts. So as we can see, for the 3 years, Basic-Fit always had a ratio below 100%. So the debt ratio was actually a rather good ratio for them compared to the other ones. Then we have the customer credit. The customer credit is a credit granted by the company to its customers, allowing them to pay for several days or several weeks. So if they get more time, they will need to wait longer for their payments, but they also give it to their customers. But as we can see, for Basic-Fit, it's for the 3 years mostly around 10 days, and in 2021 around 5 days that the customers get. So they actually pay, the customers pay rather quickly for the days that they get. So that's very good for the company, for Basic-Fit. Then we have the supplier credit. The supplier credit is then the credit granted by suppliers to the company, allowing it to pay for its purchases. And so that means if they get more days, that means if the credit is higher, they get more days to pay, so they can wait a bit longer. And as we can see, for the supplier credits for Basic-Fit, they get always more than 100 days, around 120 days. So this ratio is also very good for them. That means that for the customer credit, they pay very quickly, and the supplier credit, they get a lot of days from their suppliers to pay. So that's very good for the company. Then we have the conclusion. Should you invest in Basic-Fit? For this, I've made a table to look which ratios were actually good for the company and which ratios were actually bad for the company. And as you can see here, we see that the debt ratio, customer credit, and supplier credit were good ratios for the company, and the return on equity, return on assets, current ratio, and asset ratio were bad for the company. So to conclude, I would decide not to invest in the company because their return on equity and return on assets are actually pretty bad. The return on equity in general, because they had in 2021 a very bad return on equity, and the current ratio and asset ratio were also not good. So generally, I would say not to invest in Basic-Fit because it would not be a good investment. Thank you for listening.